有没有过一种体验，就是当你跟人说中文的时候，人家一脸迷惑的猜测和努力破解你的意思，还有人家因为听不懂而满脸尴尬又不知所措的笑笑，更或者当中国人诚心放慢速度，很努力的发音清晰的跟你沟通，你依然听不懂对方在说什么呀。Well, a big reason for this is that you might not have a deep enough understanding of Mandarin pronunciation. You see, pronunciation is the first thing I focused on in my Mandarin learning journey, and doing so paid off for me big time. I used the listen and repeat program for around 100 hours, and because of this initial work I put in, I was able to travel around China for 2 months with my handy phrasebook, and I was able to say anything from that phrasebook accurately. I could go places other travelers couldn't, made locals way more friendly towards me, and generally had a far higher level experience than I would have had otherwise. Now, getting awesome at pronunciation from the beginning also gave me some other big advantages I wasn't even aware of at the time, advantages that I'm still enjoying today, 15 years later. The biggest advantage it gave me was the huge boost to my listening ability. And that's really important because the only way to really acquire a language is to understand messages. And what I'm talking about here is getting comprehensible input. So if you have great pronunciation, you'll be able to understand what you hear much easier. Pronunciation is not just about being able to sound great, it's also being able to identify the sounds and understanding all the syllables of Mandarin on a deep level. And if you could develop a deep understanding of Mandarin pronunciation early, well, that's obviously going to give you a huge boost to your comprehension and therefore how much input you can understand and therefore how quickly you're going to acquire the language. Now, despite all this, pronunciation is often overlooked by learners and only touched upon briefly by the average Chinese tutor. They'll teach you pinyin and make you repeat some stuff over and over again, as well as some minor tone practice, but they really teach you how to pronounce this stuff and how to practice correctly to sound more like a native speaker. As a result, this foundational step in your learning is poorly done, and this leaves lots of little gaps in your skill set that over time can grow into potentially crevasses that cripple your progress. So in today's video, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to develop awesome Mandarin pronunciation that will help you not only sound like a native speaker, but also acquire Chinese a lot faster and easier. And by the way, if you aren't a beginner, you should still watch to the end because not only will you quite possibly fix some problems that you never even knew you had that are killing your gains, I'll also be giving you some important advice on how to practice for more native-like pronunciation. Ready? Let's get into it. Now what you see in front of you here is the pinyin chart. On the left are the pinyin initials. They're essentially the consonants of Chinese. And at the top here are the finals. They're essentially the vowels of Chinese. Now, almost every single Mandarin syllable, except for these few right at the top left of the chart here, are made up of 3 components: initial, final, and tone. The ones at the top there don't have an initial technically. Now we're going to start with the initials. We break these into 3 different categories. Category 1 are problem initials. These are the initials that do not exist at all in English. So these are the ones we're going to focus on most. The tougher initials kind of exist in English, but they're slightly tweaked versions of English letters. And then the green ones here are the easy initials, the ones we don't even need to talk about in today's video because they are exactly the same as they are in English. Now, as for the finals, there are simple finals and compound finals. So we're going to start, of course, with simple finals, and there's only 6 of them. That's 6 in Chinese, by the way. So in Chinese, we have the A, E, I, O, and U, and also a 6th vowel that you would be familiar with if you are a German speaker or a Swedish speaker and potentially several other languages, which I'm not really familiar with, but it is the U sound. And I'll teach you how to make that sound like a native speaker, of course, very shortly. And then we have compound finals, which, as you may have guessed, are just a combination of the simple finals. And then we finally have nasal finals, which are either simple or compound finals, but just with an N or an NG on the end. So if you go N or with an NG, you use your nose, and that's why they're called nasal finals. And once you've mastered the simple finals, you'll be able to pretty much pronounce everything perfectly. So that's where we're going to start. But before we do, let's talk about tones. Now, when it comes to tones, it's kind of the same thing I mentioned about mastering the Chinese syllables themselves. If you get a really good idea about how to pronounce the individual tones, then pronouncing tones as a pair or even as a set are far, far easier. Now, to be able to master tones and be able to speak like a native speaker and not really mess up tones too often at all, that's just going to take a ton of listening and repeating. It's just going to take practice. And to practice in the best way possible, a great idea is to get a little bit of theory. So here's the theory about how to produce all the tones. First off, you can see on the left and right of the screen are guides. Now, what these guides are showing you are your vocal range, your personal vocal range. So the top points here are your highest point in your own vocal range. So the highest point in my vocal range personally is that, what I just did, okay? So when I'm thinking, I don't go, right? And nor should you ever do that for Chinese. Never go above your vocal range, your normal, comfortable vocal range, or below that normal vocal range. Don't try and do a Barry White or something. Just stay comfortable and within your range. Let me show you what I mean. So for the first tone, for example, for me would be ma. I'm only using this particular syllable because it is one of the easiest in Chinese. It's like the first syllable that Chinese babies say. Ma. Ma, you know, technically I'm still speaking in a pretty deep way. It's just of my vocal range, the highest point. So you'll find your groove with this pretty quickly with a bit of practice. Just remember to never strain yourself to go too high or too low and you'll be fine. Don't overthink it. At Mandarin Blueprint, we call this the singing tone because it kind of sounds like, well, like I'm singing really badly. The second tone we call the unsure tone. So it starts at your mid-range and goes up to first tone level. So think about this as saying, huh? So if someone tells you something a little bit unbelievable, you just say, huh? It's that, it's just quick and it's rising. So it'd be something like this, ma, ma. So far we've got ma and ma. Another way to do this tone really well is to imitate those people that when they say a sentence, everything's a question, even though they're not asking a question, right? So it's just that at the end of a sentence. Third tone is slightly interesting because it's often taught incorrectly. So the third tone is often taught as ma, ma, like a fully down, and then like a croaky bit in the middle, and then going back up to around sort of mid-tone. We call this the full third tone, but you only ever really do that when you're saying a single syllable in isolation. So if you were gonna go around shouting horse randomly in the street like a crazy person, then it might work. Ma, ma, but you're not often going to do that. It's probably used about maybe 3% of the time like this. The other 97% of the time, it is like this, ma, ma. So it starts in the middle, goes down to the bottom, and there's like a croakiness to it. We call this the zombie tone. So think of a zombie saying brains, brains, and you're gonna get it right. And then finally we have the fourth tone, which we call the assertive tone. It's just as if you're talking to a dog who's being naughty and you say, no. So you start kind of high, kind of like around first tone-ish level, and then you just go straight down, no. In fact, this kind of starts a little bit higher than first tone. It almost gets a little bit squeaky at the beginning, but you're not gonna notice that, and don't try and do that. It just naturally comes out that way. So let's try it. Ma, ma, ma. And then finally, the fifth tone, we call the contrarian tone because it's usually the opposite of the preceding tone in terms of its pitch, but it's always, no matter what, very short and almost nothing. In fact, most people don't consider this a tone, and that's fine. I don't really know or care. I just care about sounding like a native speaker. And as we go through this video, you'll see the fifth tone in action, in context of words and even phrases. And that's the best way to master how to do it, really. It's not to analyze it on a granular level. It's just to learn how Chinese people learned by imitating entire words and phrases. So that's a brief introduction to Mandarin tones. They're not as hard as you think. Now let's go on to the simple finals. Now the first simple final we're going to talk about is A. Now there are actually 3 different Mandarin A's depending on which syllable they're a part of. There's A like cat, there's A like father, and there's E like 10. So here's some examples of words with the cat A. He, she, and it in Chinese are all different characters, but exactly the same pronunciation. Ta, ta. Afraid in Chinese is pa, pa, with a 4th tone. So this is a good opportunity for you to start practicing these tones, seeing them in action, seeing them in context. for individual sounds. And finally, la means spicy in Chinese. La, la, another fourth tone there. And we can combine these together to make our first sentence. 他怕辣. Literally, he or she or it is afraid of spicy is how you describe someone that doesn't like spicy food, can't handle it. 他怕辣, 他怕辣. So just practice those tones in succession there. While we're here practicing tones, why don't we just add a fifth tone syllable as well, and also increase the size of this sentence and make it into a question by adding ma on the end. La ma. So that ma just makes a statement into a yes-no question. Really simple. Chinese grammar is genuinely very easy. It's not that clear with the fourth tone, but you can sort of see how this fifth tone is the opposite of the previous tone, right? La ma, la ma, la ma. You see it's low and high, but very, very short. That's all the fifth tone is, just really short. We'll come back to these other two A's very shortly once we get into compound and nasal finals. Let's move on to E. Now, E is also very interesting. There are 3 different Mandarin E's depending on which syllable they're being used in, just like with A. When E is just E on its own, it is actually pronounced So it has 2 kind of sounds combined. The first part is like the in put that down. And then the final part is more like a right? But it comes from the throat. So you'll notice that my lips do not move when I pronounce this sound. Well, I guess they're moving a tiny amount, but that's just my jaw going up and down because my throat moving. Notice that my throat's doing all the work. That's very important. A very common mistake people make with Mandarin pronunciation is making your lips and your cheeks work when they don't need to. Just keep everything relaxed. So let's use this in an example sentence. Again, practicing those tones whenever possible. 他饿了, 他饿了. That's just how you say he's hungry or she's hungry in Chinese. I always thought it was kind of funny how in Chinese, the word for hungry is the same sound that we make when we taste something gross. Ugh, right? So just think about that and you'll probably get this sound perfect. Now again, we'll come back to these other 2 E's once we get into compound and nasal finals. Now I've actually subtly introduced to you a couple of what we call tougher initials. Remember from a little earlier on in the video when I mentioned that there are some sounds that are just not in English at all, but some sounds that are kind of like the English sounds, but with slight differences? Well, those are the tougher initials, and you've already kind of experienced a couple of them here. So let's just cover all of them right now, just so you have an understanding. So for example, the B, the D, and the G in Chinese are unvoiced, but actually in English they're voiced. So for example, the B in father in Chinese is ba ba, ba ba. You notice how it's like softer, more poppy? It's more like that. Whereas the B in English, such as in bit, you got the voice behind it, making it a bit more powerful of a sound. So it's more like a than it is a b. The D in Chinese, so for example, di di, di di, di di, di di. It's more like a. The D in Chinese is more like the T in store. It's more like a T sound. Whereas in English, it's a heavier voiced sound. Door, door. Close the door. Go to the store. And the G in Mandarin is more like the K in skill. It's more like a sound. Whereas in English, it's more heavy voiced gill. So like yiga, ga. This always reminds me of beatboxing, which I cannot do at all, but it's more like a than it is a b, d, g. Meanwhile, the T, the P, and the K in Chinese are heavily aspirated, whereas in English, they're less aspirated. So for example, ta, ta, ta in Chinese, as opposed to tap. Ta, you can, you've got the lots of breath behind it, lots stronger. And pa, pa, as opposed to pat. And then we've got ke, which means thirsty in Chinese, as opposed to kid, kid. So you can actually test this out by putting your hand like about a fist away from your mouth and then saying the 2 words together. Ta and tap, ta and tap. It's a big difference. And then we've got the Chinese H, which is not only a little bit more aspirated, but it's also got this sort of scratchiness to it in a lot of situations. So for example, 喝, which means to drink in Chinese, 喝, it's got that kind of like how Scottish people might say loch, right? It's got that to it. You don't have to do it really a lot, especially if you're a lady. It's not that feminine, I guess, to do it really heavy, because it's just generally that you don't hear women doing it so strongly, but there can always be that sort of a slight scratchiness to it. So you could say it 喝 as opposed to 喝, right? You'll hear both from Chinese people, but generally there's always a little bit of scratchiness to that H. Now, before we get into I, let me just tell you little thing that you'll notice about the I, the U, and the umlaut U sound. Whenever these I, U, or U sounds are said just by themselves with nothing else, they are spelt with a YI, a WU, and a YU respectively. And when these sounds are at the beginning of a pinyin syllable, they will also be spelt with the Y or the W or the Y. So as you can see here with the top line of the I section, all of these syllables are spelt with a Y, and everything else in this section is just the normal I. And I guess that's simply because it looks kind of weird if you just have E, just the letter I by itself, or Ya, I-A, just by itself. And it's also a good way of using up the other letters of the English alphabet. And remember, this is just for those few syllables at the top of each of these three sections on the pinyin chart. So for example, number 1 in Chinese is I, and we can combine it with the E sound we've already learned to pronounce the word for you can, or you have permission to do something in Chinese, which is 可以, 可以. So there's a bit of practice for your second and third tone pair, and we'll get more into tone pairs soon. Now, while we're talking about the simple final I, this is a great chance to introduce our first problem initials. They're not really that problematic at all. You just have to master a few different tongue positions, but they are technically the hardest sounds in Mandarin because they do not exist in English. And I'm assuming most of you are very familiar with English, or English is even your native language watching this. So here are all the problem initials. There are 9 of them in total, and you can master all of them with just 3 different tongue positions, none of which exist in English. But again, it's not that hard, don't worry. So the ones that are associated with the E sound are the 3 at the bottom, J, Q, and X. To pronounce them perfectly, all you need to do is put your tongue behind your bottom teeth, which makes it very difficult to speak. And while you're doing that with your tongue there, to pronounce the J in Chinese, you just say G, as in gee whiz, G, G. The key to this is to keep your tongue in that position. Don't move it. When we speak English, we're used to our tongues just sort of flopping around everywhere as we're saying, and a single word can have like 3 different tongue positions. But with Chinese, you say a sound and your tongue is fixed in position whilst that sound is being said throughout the whole thing. Ji, ji. Your tongue can, of course, move slightly. Don't like overthink this and try and say, oh, I can't move my tongue. But just keep it around the bottom teeth. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to touch your bottom teeth. It just has to be around that general position. It's probably going to be different for different people. So let's practice this sound with a simple Chinese word, which is 几个, 几个, 几个. This means how many in Chinese for small numbers, and it also means a few for small numbers. Let's try a sentence quickly. 他喝了几个? How many has he had? So if you see a guy slumped over a bar, you might ask your friend that question. 他喝了几个? That's a good way to practice all the sounds we've learned so far. 他喝了几个? Notice that 5th tone, contrarian, right? 几 is low, g is high, but very short. Another example would be 一个, 一个, which is Chinese for So for example, 一个人, 一个人. Wait a minute, I thought number 1 in Chinese, yi was pronounced with the first tone. Why is it now a second tone? 一个. Well, that's a good chance for us to now introduce tone sandy, or tone change rules in Chinese. Now there are certain situations in Chinese where tones naturally change depending on what comes afterwards. And the only reason why I'm telling you about this is not to help you get more fluent in Mandarin, because as I said before, the best way of doing that is to just get tons of immersion and listen and repeat constantly to what you hear, just like native Chinese people do. But I know if I don't teach you this tone change stuff, that it will come up and you'll notice it and you'll be confused, and being confused is not good. I'm going to go over these rules really quickly right now, but don't feel like you have to study them and memorize these rules. Just copy what you hear and you'll be fine. I just don't want you to be lost and thinking, oh, what the heck's going on? This is not what Luke taught me when you hear a tone change rule come up and you didn't know about them. So this particular character for number 1 in Chinese has 3 different tone changes depending on the context it's used in. So when it's a number, and in fact, this is the only time it's ever pronounced first tone, is when it's a number. You're specifically saying number 1 or number 100 or 1000. So for example, 11 is 11, so that's 10 plus 1. 11 or 第一, that means first, or 1000, both first tones. But when E is placed before a 4th tone character, it changes into a 2nd tone. And this makes a lot of sense because it really helps make the language flow a lot easier. So for example, a very common word which means a moment is 一下. Now the characters are 一下, but we change it to 一下, so with the 2nd tone, and that makes it flow better. Or a half of something, 一半, 一半, not 一半. And then finally, this is the weirdest one, when it's before any other tone that's not 4th tone, so 1st tone, 2nd tone, or 3rd tone, E changes into a 4th tone, 一. So for example, 很一般, which means like average, okay. 一直, that means continuously. And another very common word, 一起, 一起, which means together. And again, do not be overwhelmed by these rules. They will become second nature as long as you follow my advice previously and just listen and repeat. Now, the second major situation where tones would change in Chinese, depending on the context, is with the character 不, which means no or not. It's basically a negator in Chinese. So this is inherently a 4th tone, but luckily this is way simpler than the E. There's only one change and one context that you need to think about, and that is when 不 precedes a 4th tone. So for example, it's not 不怕, not scared, it would be 不怕. It's not 不会, it's 不会. It's not 不要, it's 不要. And again, it just makes the language flow better. That brings us on to the final tone change rule, which is for 3rd tone. When there's 2 3rd tones together, the first one will become a 2nd tone naturally. So for example, it's not 你好, it's 你好. 2nd tone, then 3rd tone. It's not 好久, it's 好久, which means a long time. It's not 很好, it's 很好. Again, makes the language flow better. Just imitate what you hear and you'll be fine. Those are the only tone change rules you really need to focus on. There are some other minor, more subtle, more advanced ones, but as long as you follow my advice and just imitate, you'll naturally pick those up too. Now, Q in Chinese is just like if you're saying chi, but with that tongue position. So imagine you're saying cheese without the SE, so C-H-E-E in English, but just with that tongue position, okay? So qi, qi, keep that tongue fixed there. And finally, the xi sound is this exactly as if you were saying she, S-H-E in English, but just with that same tongue position. So it's just xi, xi. These tongue positions will feel weird at first, but just like if you're practicing yoga for the first time or learning how to box, you just have to practice and get your muscles, your mouth muscles, your tongue muscles used to the sounds, and they will become more comfortable over time. So just for a quick review, let's just say these sounds a couple of times each. So first we have Ji, 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 and then we have Qi, it's a bit more powerful. It's like a tire being popped. Qi, Qi. And then we have the Xi, which is much softer, more gentle. Xi, Xi, Ji, Qi, Xi, Ji, Qi, Xi. Now, while we're on the subject of problem initials, why don't we just knock out the other ones right here, right now? And it's also very closely related to this I sound, because you'll notice that all of the remaining problem initials, the Z, the ZH, the CH, the SH, the R, and the C, are all located in the I section of the pinyin chart. But they're not the same I that I've taught you so far, the E sound. In fact, when you see these problem initials with an I next to them, it's kind of an imposter. It's what we call the fake I. Whoever invented pinyin gave these sounds, when they're pronounced on their own, an I final Not because they sound like an I, but simply because there's no other letters that it could work with. So let me show you what I mean by starting with these 4 at the top and introducing a new tongue position that you need to master if you want to sound like a native speaker. To pronounce all 4 of these sounds like a native speaker, you would put your tongue in a similar position to where you would say shh, the sh in English, but just move it slightly further up towards the roof of your mouth so it sounds more like this. So you're giving yourself kind of like a, does anyone know who Sean Connery is? Give yourself like a Sean Connery sort of sound to the way you speak.
Captain John Patrick Mason, General, sir.
And that's it really. So instead of saying shh, where your tongue's kind of sort of hovering around the middle here, you just shh, keep it up there a little bit. Don't try and like choke yourself with your tongue like right back here. There's no need for that. Do not strain yourself. It's like what I said about the tones. Don't go over the limits of what you're able to do, but it should feel a little bit uncomfortable, just like it did with ji qi xi down here. And the simple reason for that is you're not familiar with this tongue position yet. So let's practice with ZH. Zh, zh. So instead of z, z is around here in the middle. Zh, zh. So it's like the j, you're saying j, j in English, the j sound, but you're just raising your tongue up slightly. J. And if it helps, you can imagine that we're deleting this fake I for all these 4 sounds, and we're just adding 3 R's on the end instead. Like imagine you're doing a tiger grr sound, but it's just with that j tongue position. So j. What about SHI? Well, that would be sh, tongue slightly up, remember. What about CHI? Ch, ch, ch. Imagine it's spelled CH and 3 R's. Ch. And finally, we have what most people consider to be the hardest sound in the entire language, but actually that's only because the spelling throws people off. This is actually the easiest of all these 4. So it's just the same as zh, ch, sh, but without the ZH, the CH, or the SH. It's just the sound at the end. So imagine you're just saying those 3 R's by themselves, with that same tongue position. So let's try all 4 of these sounds one after the other. Ready? Zh, ch, sh, Pretty easy, right? Now finally, the Z and the C sound. These problem initials starting to not be so much of a problem, right? We've now got ji, qi, xi, and we've got zhi, chi, shi. The hardest sounds in the language by far, and we're already well on our way to mastering them with just getting a couple of tongue positions. Now as for the 3rd tongue position, this one is going to be around the middle behind your top teeth, and we're going to use that tongue position to pronounce Z and C in Chinese like native speakers. You ready? Let's start with ZI. So ZI is just like you're saying the DS in kids, but just by itself. So imagine you're saying kids with 2 syllables. So ki, zi, right? But your tongue is sort of touching the back of your top teeth as you do it. Zi, zi is sort of blocking the airway, letting a bit of pressure build up, and then zi, letting the air sort of flow out there. Zi, zi, zi. Again, try and keep your tongue in like a fixed position, just like with ji, qi, xi and zhi, qi, shi. Zi, zi. The only way the tongue moves is to release the air. Now the C in Chinese is pretty much exactly the same. The only difference is that it is unvoiced in the beginning. So instead of saying zi, 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 there's a voice throughout the whole thing. With the CI, it's unvoiced, so it's tss. So again, it sounds a lot like you're popping a tire and there's a lot of air escaping. Tss, tss, tss. So the air comes out first, rather powerfully, and then the sound comes in afterwards. Tss, tss. That's it. So now we've got to grips with the hardest sounds in the entire language, so it only gets easier from here. Now, after that rather long tangent into problem initials and the fake I, let's continue on our journey here. So let's get into the simple final O. This sound is the simplest one of all the simple finals, and it's pronounced like the AWE in awesome. Or. Very short, very easy. But I wanted to point out one kind of weird pinyin thing that's related to the O. If you look at the part of the pinyin chart where it's just the bo, po, mo, fo, you notice that the way I said it is not bo, po, mo, fo. Because technically, what this is actually a compound final of U and O together. So it's not bo, it's bo. It's not po, it's po. Just something to watch out for. And while we're talking about U, well, let's just jump into it. The simple final U is pronounced U, U. Now when the U sound, U, when this U sound is used on its own, it's pronounced W, U. And when it's used in combination with other spellings in compound and nasal finals, it'll be spelt with that U. So just as with E, U is spelt slightly differently when the U sound is the first part of a syllable. So all along the top line here of the U section of the pinyin chart, everything is spelt with a W because the U is first. And it looks less weird to spell it with a W than it does to spell it with a U, right? The U in Chinese sounds to me exactly like the double O in school or cool. And in fact, the word for cool in Chinese is a transliteration, which is just like an imitation of the English word. It's borrowed straight from the language, which is cool, cool. Now for the final simple final, which is including a sound again, which is not included in English, but if you are a Swedish person or a German person, you'll be familiar with this sound. It is ü. Now to produce this sound like a native speaker, a great way is to use the same tongue position as we already learned for ji, qi, and xi. So you put your tongue down behind your bottom teeth, ü. Now this sound just by itself, ü will be spelt Y-U, and it will also be spelt with a Y if it is at the beginning of these few syllables. But in every other situation, you'll see it here with the umlaut U. And if you want to type this, you hit V. So let's use it with a second tone and say the word for fish in Chinese, yu, or the word go in Chinese, chu, chu, combining it with the problem initial Q. I should really stop calling it problem initials now that they're not really a problem anymore. So now that we know all of the simple finals and we've got to grips with the tones, we can actually almost say every single syllable in Mandarin Chinese already, with a few exceptions, which I will cover very shortly. For example, just starting from the left of the pinyin chart, looking at the finals in the A section, AI is just A combined with E, so it's I. And we can say words like love in Chinese, which has a fourth tone and it sounds like this, I. So we could say, 我爱你, I love you. AO in Chinese is ah mixed with o, ao, ao, which is a sound used in the word Australia, 澳大利亚, 澳大利亚. Now we've got the two nasal finals for A, which is an, which is really simple, right? Just ah with a n sound on it. So for example, dark in Chinese is an. You could say, 这里, here, 好暗 is very dark. 他好慢, 他好慢. He's so slow, or it's so slow. And finally, the last A final, which introduces the second pronunciation of A that I mentioned way back in the beginning of the video. Remember, there's 3 different A sounds. We've already covered A. Well, this is the second one, ah. And we use it for the nasal final, A-N-G. Do not tighten your mouth or smile as you might slightly do if you did the sound ah, ah. With this sound, your cheeks are more relaxed and your jaw is just slightly open, ong, ong. So the A is just like the A in father. So you'll notice this sound in the very common word for help in Chinese, which is bang, bang. So for example, help me, bang wo, bang wo. Moving on to the E section of the pinyin chart, just to remind you, there are 3 different E's. The first one we've already learned, or for hungry. Now the second pronunciation of E is actually just half of the first pronunciation. It's the first sound before it goes And we've actually already covered a couple of Mandarin syllables with this pronunciation. For example, le, 他饿了, It's just that very short first half of the full E. And this is also used in the nasal compound finals, and Now, when used on its own with that 4th tone sound, actually means to push something down, which is a relatively high level word, but a more common word with this sound would be the word for stupid or dumb in Chinese, which is bun, bun. So imagine you're saying the very first syllable of the word banana, banana, bun, and you'll pretty much say it perfectly. Is really similar. It's just that same sound, but with a ng at the end. So for example, 生日. That's a good way to practice those proper initials, sh and r, 生日, 生日, which is birthday in Chinese. And there's also one compound final in the E section of the pinyin chart, which is pronounced A. So it's the third and final different pronunciation for a Mandarin E, which is just like the E in the number 10. So it's a sound. So it's plus E, which is A. It's exactly like the EI spelling in the word vein. And then finally, we've got what I call kind of a wild card pronunciation in Mandarin Chinese, which is the R. You'll notice if you look at the pinyin chart that R is just kind of all on its own. It's got no other combination with any other final. It's a wild card. It's just one of a kind. Combine it with the fourth tone and you can say number 2 in Chinese. R. You probably most commonly use this sound when you're doing something called 儿化 in Chinese, which is basically adding that R sound on the end of many different words. So for example, where in Chinese is 在哪里, 在哪里, but it's very commonly pronounced like this, 在哪儿, 在哪儿, with just the R sound. Now, this comes from the north of China, but it's used everywhere. It's part of standard Mandarin too, and I personally love to use it. I prefer to say, for example, 玩 when I say the word play in Chinese instead of 玩, but that's just personal preference. Now onto the O section of the pinyin chart, and we won't be here for very long. There's literally just 2 finals to learn here. The first is ong, which is just o plus ng, ong, and a good word to use to practice this sound would be China in Chinese, which is 中国, which is also a rather challenging tone pair. 中国. And then we have O, which is just, of course, O plus U, which is O. You can also combine this with a Z to make a very common word, 走, which means, well, it could mean to walk or it could mean to leave. Now onto the I section of the pinyin chart. So as you can see, there are quite a few more here, but they're just combinations of stuff you already know. So let's start off with ya, which is just E combined with a, and it would be spelled Y-A. Yeah, and a really common phrase for this, which is something I've actually used all the time now in English and Chinese, just generally it's part of my life, is the word aya. So if something happens, you stub your toe, you drop something, something scares you, aya. So that's super common. Or you could say jia, combine it with the J that we've already learned, and say the word for home in Chinese. 这是我的家, this is my home. Then we have the IAO or the YAO, which is how it would be spelled. 要, I want, 我要. 我要那个, 我要这个, or 我叫 Luke. So again, you can add that J and it becomes called in Chinese. So if you want to say my name is in Chinese, you say 我叫 and then your name. Next, we have the pronunciation ye, which is E plus e, that third pronunciation of E that sounds like the E in number 10. So most likely the most common word for this pronunciation would be ye with a third tone, which means also in Chinese. So if someone says to you, 我爱你, I love you, it's polite to say 我也爱你. Another super common ye sound would be, of course, thank you in Chinese, which is 谢谢, which is a fourth tone followed by a fifth tone. 谢谢. So now you've got to grips with the individual tones. The next step is to focus on pairs of tones. Now, as you can see, there are 19 possible combinations. The reason why there's 19 and not 20 is because there's no such thing as a third and third tone. So if you look at the chart, you'll notice that that also is just second and third tone. I think it's a really good idea for you to practice all of these tone pairs just a little bit every day, just for like 30 seconds or a minute. Whenever you can, just practice these tone pairs because some of them are significantly more challenging than others. So I'll give you some examples of ones that I think are especially hard. The first tone, second tone, 中国, 中国. That catches people out quite a bit. Another one that catches people out is the fourth tone to first tone. So 用功, 自私. Just watch out for that one too. And I think maybe even, in my opinion, the toughest one of the whole lot is the third tone, second tone one. 好玩, 好玩，有名，有名. If you'd like more practice with these tone pairs, plus just a more in-depth guide to pronunciation, you can get access to our short course, Pronunciation Mastery. So you can learn everything you need to know about Mandarin pronunciation in 6 hours. There's also 2 hours of bonus video where Phil and myself talk about all kinds of different topics that relate to acquiring Chinese to a high level. The course also comes with 1,000 multimedia flashcards, which you can review using SRS. And you'll also learn over 200 common Mandarin words and phrases whilst you master all the different sounds and tones of the language. Next on the pinyin chart is yo, which is I plus O plus U, I, O, U, yo, which will be spelled Y-O-U. And of course, the most common word for this would be you, which means to have in Chinese. So you could say, 你有车吗? Do you have a car? And then to answer, you would say, 有. And that is a situation where you can actually say the full third tone. Look at that, because you would be saying one single syllable in isolation. And if you wanted to practice multiple third tones together, you could say, 我也有. So a really common question we get about third tone is, yeah, we know that 2 third tones together becomes a second third tone, 我有 or 也有. But what about when you have 3 third tones together or 4 third tones together? Well, again, if you just imitate and immerse a lot, you will naturally be able to produce these. But basically, there are 2 different ways you can do it usually. So you could say 我也有 or 我也有. It really doesn't matter that much. Which finally grants us the third and final pronunciation for A in Chinese. So remember, we've got the cat A as in an, and we've got the father A as in ang. Now we've got the, let's say, the 10A. It's got the same pronunciation as the E in 10, and of course the E in the Mandarin pronunciation, yeah. And you'll only hear A pronounced this way in Chinese for this particular syllable, yen, and another syllable, which we'll get to in a minute, yuan. So a really common word in Chinese for this would be cigarette, yen. So you'll get this question a lot in Chinese, 你抽烟吗? Now, while there's a bit of a stigma associated with smoking in the West, in China, it's extremely common and normal, and you will be often asked if you want to smoke. So, 你抽烟吗? And if you wanted to say no thanks, you would say 不抽烟, 不抽烟, 谢谢. Another really common word with the yen pronunciation would be 再见, which means bye-bye in Chinese. 再见, again, see. Next we have the I-A-N-G sound, which if it's by itself will be spelled Y-A-N-G. If you knew nothing about pinyin or Mandarin before you watched this video, you might think that this is pronounced yang because it has the ang spelling there, right? But actually it's not. It's pronounced yang, is with an ah sound. So be sure to watch out for that. And a very common word for this is 一样, which literally means one appearance, and it's the very common word for the same in Chinese. And there's also the word 两, which you would use if you're saying 2 of something. So for example, 两个. And this would pretty much, I think, always be combined with a 个, which is the universal measure word in Chinese. So you would have 两个and then add whatever the name is of the thing. And let's be fancy and combine it with the word that we just learned, 这两个一样. These 2 are the same. The next sound would be I-N in Chinese, or Y-I-N if it's by itself, which would be pronounced in. So it's just E with a N on the end of it. So imagine you're saying a word spelled E-E-N, in, and this relates nicely to a word that is very relevant to this video, which is pinyin. What we're learning is the spell sounds of Mandarin, the spellings and the sounds combined, pinyin. You could also practice the word 今天, which means today in Chinese, 今天, or 您好. So you've already heard 你好 in today's video, which means hello in Chinese. 您好 is what you would say if you're talking to someone with more respect. And another nasal final for the I section of the pinyin chart would be 音. So a really common word for this would be 电影. Now often you would hear 电影 or 电影, like a y sort of sound thrown in there. Both are very common. Technically, the most standard Mandarin would be the first one, 电影. But it's really common, especially among northern Chinese people, to hear a 电影 电影 or 停, which means stop in Chinese, you would hear 停, 停. It's got kind of, I like to call it like goofy. It's like it's got that kind of in it. 电影 or 停 instead of 停, 停. Both are absolutely fine to use, but if you want to sound most standard, you just use it without the y sound. And finally, for the I section, we have one more nasal final, which is 用, 用. And the most common word probably is if you add a fourth tone and pronounce it 用, which means to use. Incredibly common word, of course. And something is 有用. It literally means has use, which is the Chinese word for useful. 有用, 有用. Switch up the tones a little bit and you've got 游泳, 游泳, which means swimming. All right, so let's move on to the U section of the pinyin chart. And we're going to start with wa, which is of course just u plus a, wa. Here's a word you can practice. Wa sai, wa sai. Now, Chinese people do have a word for wow. They literally just transliterate the word wow, wow. But this word is the direct Chinese version of wow. Wa sai. You can also try this one. Hua, which means flower. And with this word, it's really common to add the er hua I mentioned earlier and pronounce it huar. Next one is wo. Now, we already covered this earlier on, but let's go over it one more time quickly. It's just u plus o, so that's u, o, wo. And of course, we have the very common word wo with a third tone, which means I or me. And you could also practice the word 多少, 多少, which means how many in Chinese, but for larger numbers than 几个. So while we're here, let's introduce a very common phrase in Chinese, which will also allow you to practice what I like to call tongue acrobatics in Chinese. So what I mean by tongue acrobatics is that, of course, you know now that there are problem initials in Chinese. There are certain consonants, the zhi, zhi, shi, zhi, the zi, ci, and of course the ji, qi, xi, that do not exist in English. But some words make you do these problem initials, several of them in a row in quick succession, and it's tough at first. So for example, this word, 多少钱, 多少钱. So what you're doing here is 少, your tongue is up, and then immediately 钱 is down. 多少钱. So it's a little bit tough at first, but don't worry, as I said earlier, with practice, it will get lots easier. But in fact, this sound is not even that easy for native speakers. That's why you'll often hear them shorten these words, just like we do in English with lots of words. So they'll say, instead of 多少钱, they'll say 多少钱, 多少. It turns into an R sound, the r, 少钱, 多少钱. So I personally do this. I like to add the 多少钱, 多少钱 instead of 多少钱, just because, you know, it's easier. Next is wei, which is technically U-E-I or W-E-I when it's just that wei sound by itself. But they only do this when you add another consonant before it. A very common phrase that you'll see in Chinese is 几位. You'll be asked this pretty much every time you walk into a restaurant. It just means how many customers, how many guests. Wei is the polite measure word for a guest or a customer. And if you wanted to say two people, which most of the time you would, right? You would say 两位, 两位. And you can see it here, it's spelled W-E-I, as it is for the word for why in Chinese. 为什么? 为什么? Which literally means for the sake of what. But if we put a D in front of it, it's going to be spelled D-U-I. 对, which is most commonly the pronunciation for the word correct. Next we have Y, which is U-A-I. So it's U-A-I, U-A-I. And of course, this will be spelled W-A-I on its own. And a really common word for this, which I use a little bit too much, would be 外卖, which means food delivery, literally outside sell. So 点外卖 is order takeout. Put a K in front of this sound and the fourth tone, and you've got fast in Chinese, 快, which is also the pronunciation for a measure word for money in Chinese. So you might say 几块钱 for a very small amount of money, so less than 10 kuai, let's say, less than 10 units of that currency. So if you're buying like chewing gum or something like that, you might say 几块钱, or a bottle of water, 几块钱, which means how many units of money. Next, we've got wan, U-A-N, or W-A-N. And if you wanted to say too late, as in the time is too late in Chinese, you would say 太晚了, 太晚了. This 太了 is a fixed structure that means too much of something. Add an H in front of it, and you've got the basis for the word like in Chinese, which is 喜欢, 喜欢, which is third tone, fifth tone. So we can practice our tone change rules here for third tone by teaching you the phrase, he likes dogs. 他很喜欢狗. 很喜欢狗. Next we've got wen, wen. So that's the n sound that we learned earlier with the u in front of it. Wen, wen. And this is of course spelt W-E-N when you're just using that phrase on its own. For example, with the Chinese word for ask, which is wen with the fourth tone. Wen. So in a more polite fashion, you might say 请问 before you ask a question. 请问. Or practicing a few tones in a row, we could say 没问题, 没问题, second, fourth, second. Put a G in front of the sound and you've got a rather dangerous word, 滚, which is basically go away, but in a very strong fashion. It's more like the F word, right? So be really careful with how you use this one. But you can also use it in a joking fashion with friends. You can say, 滚, if someone's making fun of you, 滚, 滚. That's absolutely fine. But do not do it to a stranger if you're actually angry, unless you are ready for a physical altercation of some kind. And finally, we've got two more U finals, which are wang and weng. So wang is going to be spelled U-A-N-G or W-A-N-G. And remember, it's using the father A, the wang with the jaw sort of open a little bit. It's not wang, okay? I know we've had yang, and that may be confusing a little bit, but that's only because the I is in front of the ang sound. And that's the only situation where it's pronounced ang. Really common word for this is wang, as in forget in Chinese. 我忘了, 我忘了, I forgot. Put an SH in front of this sound and add a third tone and you've got 爽. This can be used in so many different ways, but it essentially means I've got what I wanted and I feel really good about that. So if you're thirsty and you have a drink, if you're hungry and you eat some amazing meal, and a bunch of other ways you'll discover once you start exploring the language a bit further. And then finally, we've got weng, which is super rare. In fact, if you look at the pinyin chart, you can see it's just weng. It's not combined with any other initials. And you'll just see it in a few rare words or sounds. Like for example, a bee buzzing is weng, 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 weng. That's just like an onomatopoeia for that sound. And now finally we come to the last section of the pinyin chart, which is super short, which is all about the umlaut U, the U sound. Now the first one is yue, yue, U plus e, the third pronunciation of E. And I guess the most common word for this would be with a fourth tone, yue, yue, which means month in Chinese. Now remember with this U sound, you want to have your tongue behind your bottom teeth to make it that authentic native sounding yu, yue. A really common mistake that people make with this is that they separate the sounds too much, so it sounds kind of like this, yue, yue, whereas actually it should be one single sound, yue, yue. So practice that a little bit and make sure you don't separate them at all. Next we have yuan, and with this pronunciation you have to be careful because a lot of people pronounce it incorrectly as yuan, right? There is no yuan sound in Chinese. It's so easy to make these kinds of mistakes, the way pinyin is kind of laid out and spelt. In fact, Mandarin Blueprint co-founder Phil Crimmins made this exact mistake with this initial. When we were actually first getting together and working on this company together, we were in a coffee shop and I actually noticed him saying Q-U-A-N, pronouncing it as chuan instead of chuen. These kinds of mistakes might start small and seem insignificant, but over time, if you just cement them with practice, then you'll end up with bad habits that are really hard to break. So this yuan sound will be spelled Y-U-A-N, and I suppose the most common word with this pronunciation is with a third tone, yuan, yuan, which means far away. So how would you say too far away in Chinese? 太远了, 太远了. Again, showing that fifth tone, contrarian fifth tone, 远了. Now this final only combines with three other consonants, the J, the Q, the X. So here's a very common word which means to choose in Chinese, 选择. 选择, which will give us a chance to practice one of the most challenging tone pairs, the second tone pair, 选择. And finally, the final of the pinyin chart, yun. Now the best way to make this sound like a native speaker is to imagine that it's spelt slightly differently. Imagine that it's spelt Y-U-E-E-N, yun, yun. You don't have to do the E so strongly, nor do you have to smile or anything like that, but that slight tweak to it, having a slight E sound in there, will sound more native. Yun, 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 yun. So a really common word for this would be 运气, 运气, which is luck in Chinese. Or you could add a second tone and say the word for cloud. Yun, yun. In my opinion, this one sounds like the most non-English of all of the sounds of pinyin. And again, this sound only combines with J, Q, and X. For example, in 军队, which means army, 裙子, which means skirt, and then finally 训练, which means training. And finally, with this sound, it's going to be spelt exactly the same as a rather different pinyin final we've already covered. Wen, which is U-E-N. Because they dropped that E, it's going to be spelt U-N exactly the same way. But don't worry about getting it confused too much, because remember, the yun sound only combines with J, Q, and X. So if you ever see these 4 spellings, yun, xun, chun, and jun, then you'll know what the pronunciation is, because your tongue has to be behind your bottom teeth and you have to be making that U sound to be able to say it. All right, so that's it. That is the entire pinyin chart covered in just a few minutes. So you have now learned all of the building blocks of pronunciation. We haven't necessarily covered every single one of the 400+ syllables in Mandarin, but you have the tools to be able to pronounce them like a native speaker now, because you now have a solid understanding of all of the initials and all of the finals and the tones, and those are the 3 elements that make up every single Mandarin sound. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to start speaking Mandarin Chinese like a native speaker and be mistaken for a native speaker right now. You may be able to very soon, but what you need to do to get there is practice. And that's why I made this video right here. So go watch that and apply the techniques to your daily study routine and start wowing native speakers with your Chinese.